Budget surplus.
Budget surplus.
Budget surplus.
The largest back-to-back surpluses on record.
To me, the idea that any government would brag about a budget surplus is kind of a sick joke. Treasurers, state and federal, fixate on the idea of a surplus as if it were the equivalent of winning the World Cup or something. Whenever I hear a politician brag about a surplus, well, I don't care if you're this guy, or this guy. Bragging about a surplus just really
Crikey dingo.
hits me.
Why though, son?
I have a bunch of reasons really, but before we get to those, let's look at what a federal budget is. Basically, it's just the plan the government has for collecting and spending money. The government forecast how much money they'll collect from various taxes and other forms of income, and they forecast how much they will spend and what they'll spend it on. That's really the budget in a nutshell. So the government released the budget with a song and dance outlining how much money they think they'll make and how much money they think they'll spend. The figures announced with the budget will rarely, if ever, match up with the actual figures at the end of the financial year. That's just how it is. At the end of the financial year, the government come back and tell us how close they were to getting it right. If they end up with more money than they expected to have when they put forward their initial budget, the government gets to run a victory lap thanks to delivering a surplus. If they end up with less money than they expected, then they're baddies for delivering a deficit. Not that this means much to the average punter. Shout out to punters politics. Because let's face it, for you and I, it really means nothing. We've had 2 consecutive surpluses, yet cost of living's gone up. Rent, if you can find a place, that's gone up. Do you feel better in the knowledge that this is the first back-to-back surplus since Peter Costello was hanging around? If the surplus stuff hadn't hit the news cycle, do you think you'd have felt it in your day-to-day?
Hell no.
Back in May, the government were forecasting a surplus for the 23-24 financial year of $9.3 billion. Their guesstimate was not quite right.
The Albanese Labor government has delivered a second consecutive budget surplus, a $15.8 billion surplus.
And Jim Chalmers was at pains to point out, though, that the surplus wasn't the result of increased taxes, but the result of lower than expected spending.
It's really important to recognise that this surplus is bigger at the end of the financial year than we anticipated in May, not because taxes are higher, but because spending is lower. Spending in the last financial year was much lower than anticipated at budget, and revenue was lower as well. Spending was down by around twice as much as revenue was down. So this bigger surplus is not because we taxed more, it's because we spent less, and that's an important thing to recognise.
On the surface, any treasurer will play that off as
responsible economic management.
Politicians love that term.
This is a powerful demonstration of our responsible economic management.
And on the surface, yeah, sure, it sounds nice, but is delivering a surplus, particularly one that was larger than forecast in May, the result of responsible economic management or something else? Here's the Finance Minister.
It's not on the receipt side of the budget, it's on the spending side, and there's a reason, there's a few moving parts in that. There's some payments to the states, there's some timing issues there, and then there's some demand-driven programs which haven't had as much uptake.
So if you missed it, the reason the budget surplus was even higher than forecast was due to a combination of lower than expected demand for programs as well as deferred payments to states. This was not the result of any specific action the government took or any policy change. But here's the Finance Minister again.
Of the $10.2 billion in lower than expected government outlays, what proportion of that is due to the deferral of payments into future budgets versus lower than expected claims or demand for government programs?
Yeah, so in terms of, there's a chunk that is about lower demand-driven programs. So there's a few in aged care, in the COVID-19 vaccines, for example. And then there is another kind of sizable chunk, which is about national payments, national partnership payments to the states. And that can be for a variety of reasons: failure to sign up, failure to meet milestones, or there's some timing delay. So I would say it's both of those things, contributing, demand-driven programs, and then payments to the states. This is on the spending side that's allowed us to have an improved surplus.
You can find the breakdown in the budget papers. $4.2 billion is essentially just deferred spending, the result of delays to state-delivered programs through national partnership agreements. You'd have to expect that most of that $4.2 billion will just get spent in the current financial year now instead. An example of some of that deferred spending is the $1 billion less that was spent on the Assistance to People with Disabilities program, which was simply a result of Western Australia not having signed a full-scheme bilateral agreement with the Commonwealth by 30th of June. In other words, the federal government spent $1 billion less than they'd forecast because Western Australia didn't get their shit together in time. The remaining underspend is a result of lower than expected demand or delivery delays for a bunch of programs in areas such as aged care, vaccination programs and onshore detention. In other words, the federal government spent billions of dollars less than expected due to factors outside their direct control. Got it. For what it's worth, it was the same story for the 22-23 financial year. Receipts were just under $13 billion more than estimated in the budget, thanks largely to company taxes being higher than expected, thanks to sustained elevated commodity prices. Spending was $4 billion lower than expected thanks to the good old lower than expected demand for programs thing again. Which reminds me of some tongue-in-cheek advice I was given once. Under-promise and over-deliver. Look, I'm sure I lost the die-hard Labor supporters about 30 seconds in.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure those are gone.
If they haven't already boycotted this channel completely. But I have to say that this isn't just a dig at Labor. This is a dig at any government that runs with this surplus crap, past, present and future. Remember Peter Costello? Like it or not, he ran surpluses for close to a decade. Paul Keating called him the laziest, most indolent, unimaginative treasurer in our post-war history, and also said of Costello's hand in the country's financial performance that he'd spent 10 years in a hammock.
These are the first consecutive surpluses in almost 2 decades. In our first year, a $22 billion surplus, which was a $100 billion turnaround. In our second year, a $15.8 billion surplus, which is a $72 billion turnaround. That $172 billion turnaround in just 2 years is the biggest nominal improvement in the budget in a parliamentary term ever.
When Jim Chalmers boasts about this massive turnaround, it's pretty much all spin. As Greg Jericho points out in The Guardian, it's all been due to the improved parameter variations, in other words, prices of iron ore, gas and economic growth. The $100 billion improvement occurred purely because the forecast in the 2022 budget was massively wrong. Spin and budget chat go hand in hand. I mean, Labor have falsely claimed to inherit the worst set of books in history as the coalition falsely claimed before them. That's a story for another day. But if you think delivering 2 surpluses makes Jim Chalmers an economic genius, then I'm guessing you view Peter Costello as the love child of Stephen Hawking and Albert Einstein. Actually, there's a little irony here because you can argue that Costello has inadvertently helped Chalmers deliver his 2 back-to-back surpluses. Why? Well, because of the Costello-created Future Fund and fine print that it seems Penny Wong had a hand in back in 2012. You see, when Penny Wong was Finance Minister back in 2012, she pushed through changes, supported by both major parties, that allowed the Future Fund's net earnings to prop up the federal budget's underlying cash balance from the 2020 to 21 financial year onwards. You'll find the fine print in the budget papers too. Under the Future Fund Act 2006, net Future Fund earnings became available to meet the Australian government's superannuation liability from 2020 to 2021. From this time, the underlying cash balance includes expected net Future Fund earnings. In other words, Future Fund net earnings count toward the budget bottom line. Yay for accounting. Yeah, accounting. If you've followed the Housing Australia Future Fund, you'll be aware of another accounting trick that makes surplus and deficit chat pretty meaningless. These budget numbers, the pollies fall over themselves to either take credit for or distance themselves from, depending on the result. They don't account for the massive slabs of off-budget spending. Off-budget spending doesn't appear in the underlying budget balance and therefore isn't factored into the figure that drives all the media reporting. Delivering a surplus, well, in my opinion, it's really nothing to crow about in the middle of both a cost of living and a housing crisis. You've ended up with more money than you expected, congrats. You couldn't think of anything that surplus could have been redirected to at all? No? Fair enough then. Despite the spin, it's important to remember a government surplus is delivered off the back of the choices the government makes, and in turn off the backs of the Australian public. I'm doubt I'm the only one that has a hard time listening to a government talk up their $1 billion surplus whilst at the same time refusing to raise the rate, for example. The budget is all about the choices a government makes. Delivering a surplus while keeping unemployment benefits hundreds of dollars below the poverty line, that's a choice. Jacqui Lambie gets it.
Nobody gives a stuff about a surplus, mate. I can assure you right now, people are doing it hard out there. Nobody's talking about a surplus, and if they were and they truly understood, they'd be saying, well, how about you put some of that surplus out to us so we can put bread and milk on the table for our kids.
Treasurers like Jim Chalmers might like to talk about their surplus, and he loves to mention it a lot. But these budget figures tell us next to nothing about how good or bad a government is at managing the economy. All it does is give us an insight into the decisions a government is prepared to make in order to, with a little luck, have its annual moment in the sun. At the end of the day, I'd say Jacqui Lambie is right.
Nobody gives a stuff about a surplus, mate. I can assure you right now, people are doing it hard out there.
Nailed it.